morning.
I have a question for you.
With these type of like pie charts, is it super important to memorize the percentages?
No.
Okay. I just was like, there's another one with like the skeletal muscle where it's like.
Yeah, no, it's just to demonstrate that there's more.
Okay.
Basically, yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I think so. That I started to find out. Filtration and absorption. Yes. So filtrate is the one that are going out. Oh, right. And if it's negative, then it's stagnant. If it would be positive, it would be okay.
So I heard some good discussion about this problem, so hopefully you've all taken a look. I'm going to say about this concept, the net filtration pressure, it's worth spending a good amount of time on this concept because we're talking about it now in exam 1, but it is going to come back to haunt us again in exam 3. So let's make sure it makes sense now so that when we start adding extra information about the kidneys onto this concept, or at least starting from a good base. We're gonna work through our starling forces here, figure out what their direction is, and we're gonna remember how we calculate the net filtration pressure. So that's our overall direction of flow. And then we're gonna figure out which end of the capillary this is. That one you can probably figure out from checking it out. So we're just gonna start at the top. So as a reminder, when we see that P, these are our hydrostatic pressures. So PIF and P capillary are hydrostatic pressures. So they're like a push from fluid. So they're always going to go in the opposite direction from their little subscript. So we're going to have a push from the interstitial fluid, and we're going to have a push from the capillary. It's that fluid pushing out. When we see pi, that's telling us we're talking about our osmotic or oncotic pressure if we're going to specify it's from proteins. Okay. So these are our pulls, right? So this is our non-permeating solutes pulling fluid towards them. Right? So these are always going to be in the direction of the subscript. So this is going to be the pull of proteins in the interstitial fluid towards the interstitial fluid. This is going to be the pull of proteins in the blood towards the capillary. So if we draw them on, so starting here with our hydrostatic pressure of the interstitial fluid. So we're talking about the push of fluid towards the capillary, into the capillary. So what's the word for this direction? Anyone want to say? Yeah. This is absorption or reabsorption. Absorption. All right, I have terrible spelling. Okay. Okay. So then if we're thinking about the next one, our opposite hydrostatic pressure, the push from the capillary out towards the interstitial fluid. What's our word for that then? Perfect. Okay, yeah. So this is our filtration. And then we can match that up, the directions of those arrows, with the arrows we're going to draw for our osmotic pressure. So if we're thinking about the osmotic pressure of the interstitial fluid, we're saying we have a solute in the interstitial fluid. It's pulling fluid towards it. So which direction is this? Filtration or absorption? Perfect. Yeah, filtration. And then our final force, our osmotic oncotic pressure of the capillary, a force from proteins in the capillary, pulling fluid towards them, is going to be our last force for absorption. Okay. How are we doing so far? Any questions on this part, figuring out those directions and the filtration absorption? Okay. Okay. So that's how we look at these forces first. So then our second task is to calculate the net filtration pressure. So we're trying to figure out overall, given these forces, when we add them all up, is the fluid coming out of the capillary or is it going into the capillary? We care about that because if it's going out of the capillary, it may be causing swelling in the tissue. If it's coming into the capillary, it may be raising blood pressure. Depending on the situation, this may have effects on the physiology. Okay. So to do that, we're going to get a number and we're going to add together our forces for filtration. And because we start with these forces for filtration, that means that when we get a number for our NFP, if it's positive, that says we have more forces for filtration. So positive numbers are going to mean filtration is happening. So we subtract our forces for absorption or reabsorption. Okay. And because this comes second, because these are what we're subtracting, that means that if we get a negative number for our NFP, that's going to be overall, we're having absorption happening. Overall, we're having fluid go into the capillary. Okay, so that positive is filtration, negative is absorption. So we're starting with our two forces for filtration. We're going to have 16 plus 1. So that's going to be 17 for our filtration. And then we're going to take our two forces for absorption. So that's going to be 25 plus 1. 26. We're subtracting the two. So what do we get? -9. Great. So our net filtration pressure here that we've described is -9. So what does that mean for the fluid? What's happening here? Yeah. Overall, we have absorption happening. So those absorption forces are winning. So our net filtration pressure here is telling us we have fluid moving back into the capillary. So there are a couple ways you can figure out which end of the capillary we're talking about here. You could either remember which value indicates whether we're on the arterial end or the venous end, or you could remember that the direction overall is kind of going to tell us whether we're at the arterial end or the venual end, because we have opposite things happening at either end. So what end do we think we're on here? Perfect. Yeah, we're on the venous end, the venual end, or veins, right? Okay. Because our arterial end, we have fluid coming out and into the tissue, right? Because it's bringing stuff to the tissue, it's bringing important nutrients. At our venual end, that's the end where we do our reabsorbing, we're getting rid of waste products. So this is helpful for us. The questions about this concept, now that you've had a little time to internalize it, hopefully, since our last class, and we've done an extra practice. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Does it matter if it's a vein or what vein is?
No, venous is right, vein is shorter. We're going, yeah, basically. Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about our venules and veins, which is where we left off last time. Okay. When we were talking last time, we're talking about how the veins work, how blood gets back to the heart. Right? Because the artery end works by a lot of pressure coming out of the heart, that cardiac output, that flow going out. And also a lot of our arteries move down from the heart because our heart is positioned pretty superior in the body. But most of our veins are having to travel against gravity. We don't have all that much pressure coming from the flow of blood itself. So here's a better description than, or a better depiction than my bad drawing from last time of our skeletal muscle pump. So that's what we're looking at here. So our first way we can return blood to the heart is our skeletal muscle pump. We're going to see we have two types of pumps we're talking about, which is why I'm specifying here. This is the muscle pump. All right. So you can kind of think about, someone has probably at some point told you like to relax, or when you're meditating to sort of contract your muscles in a specific order and relax them. One of the theories behind why we do that and why that could help is to improve venous return to the heart. And if you contract sort of from the bottom of your body up, from the extremities out, you are actively pushing blood back to your heart. So the reason we can do that is because of these one-way valves in the veins. So if we're looking at the cap here, in our relaxed state, we just have this open tube, right? But when we have muscle contract, suddenly this tube has less space in it, right? And we have this kind of inverse relationship between space in a container and pressure. So if you have less space, pressure goes up. And we'll talk about that a fair bit when we talk about the lungs. And that's a kind of tip for the future, right? Okay. So we make less space in this vein, which means we're causing the pressure to increase, which is going to force those valves open, right? So it's forcing the valves open. And those valves can open only in the direction that goes towards the heart. So this forces blood into the next segment of that vein. Now your muscle does relax, right? You're not constantly, every muscle super tense, right? So this would cause blood to potentially want to sink back into the previous segment, the more proximal segment, but it can't get there because that valve is closed. But we would have more muscles up here, right, proximally closer to the heart. So this sort of progressive contraction of muscles returns blood to your heart. Now, we don't sit here and consciously do this most of the time. When we talk about the skeletal muscle pump, what we are kind of saying is just, you know, walking around, having normal activity, moving at all has this effect. Because the blood, when you're not contracting the muscle, is just in that segment. So we don't have to always contract them exactly in order because muscles are acting independently on these segments. That's those one-way valves, super important for returning blood to the thoracic cavity. Mm-hmm.
How does that work if you're unconscious? They're like, ooh, you know, go to conscious and take over.
If you're unconscious, you would not be using your skeletal muscle pump. That would be my assumption. So you'd probably be using your respiratory pump, which we're going to talk about next. So long as you're still breathing, that's another way we affect the pressure going back to the heart. Probably you would all, we're going to talk about how there's hormonal and sympathetic control of like tone in the veins. So you would expect to see some of the responses for that, like changing the compliance of the veins and making it a little bit easier to return blood to the heart that way.
It's a long-term coma. They have cuts that
Oh, that pulse?
air,
That's
yeah,
cool.
that go up the length and stuff.
That's neat. It's so cool the things I can do. Okay. We're going to talk about the respiratory pump next. But to understand what's going on with the respiratory pump, it's helpful to think a little bit about what is going on when you breathe, which I know we haven't talked about yet. Okay. What happens when you breathe, right? When you breathe in, we're going to talk about this in our next unit, but what's happening is a muscle called your diaphragm. And are you guys into the thorax yet in lab? I'm not in lab this semester. Okay. So muscle in your diaphragm is right below your lungs. What happens when you breathe in is it drops down, creating more space for your lungs to expand. And when you breathe out, that muscle relaxes. And when it relaxes, it bulges up, making that space for the lungs smaller. And this is the main thing that causes the movement of air. We'll talk about other forces when we're in that respiratory unit, but this is the big thing. And if people tell you to like belly breathe, what they're trying to emphasize here is that movement of the diaphragm. So when we're thinking about inhalation, breathing in, contraction of the diaphragm, moving it down and making more space for those lungs, what do you think is happening to the pressure in the thorax? I think it's high or low. Yeah, it does. Okay. So he said that this decreases the pressure, and that's true. So decrease in pressure. And the reason for that is kind of the same as when we were talking about the skeletal muscle pump. This is about that relationship between the amount of space, the volume of the container and its pressure. So when we make the space for the lungs bigger by moving the diaphragm down, we've made the space bigger, we've made the thoracic cavity bigger, but at the beginning we have the same amount of stuff in there. So this is creating a dropping pressure in the thorax. And when we talk about the lungs, we'll see that that's actually why air moves there, right? This drop in pressure creates a pressure gradient. We talked about pressure gradients. So that causes movement of air. But we're talking about it now because that also has an effect on other structures in the thorax. Specifically for us right now, this has an effect on the veins in the thorax. So this next part would not be intuitive if you don't have this sort of context for breathing, which is why we're doing that right there. Okay. So the respiratory pump, when we're breathing in, when we're making that thoracic cavity big so the air moves into the lungs, we're decreasing the pressure in the thoracic cavity. And at the same time, that diaphragm moving down, it's making your thorax bigger, it's making that space in the rib cage bigger. But you have to get that space from somewhere, and the place you're getting it from is the abdomen. So that diaphragm is moving down into the abdomen, pressing everything in the abdomen closer together. So because we're pressing all the contents of the abdominal cavity closer together, we're increasing pressure in the abdominal cavity. And this means that we've created a pressure gradient, right? So here we're gonna have our thorax, our rib cage, or our lungs. Right. Here we have our abdominal cavity below. All right, so now we have a pressure gradient where we have high pressure in the abdomen. We have low pressure in the thorax. What do we remember about gradients? What direction do we go? High to low or low to high? Yeah, perfect. High to low, right? So we go from high pressure to low pressure. That's how everything moves, basically, right? Things are trying to not be under so much pressure. So whether we're talking about fluid, we're moving high pressure to low pressure. We're talking about air next time, we're going to move high pressure to low pressure. When we talked about gradients with chemicals, right, they also move from areas of high concentration to low concentration. So when we talk about gradients, we're always thinking about movement from high to low. Okay, so this is great for our veins because our heart is in our thorax. All right, so our heart's up here. All right, so here is where we're moving from those peripheral veins into this low pressure of our central veins in the thorax. All right, so this is kind of sucking blood up into the thorax and into the heart. So this is increasing the venous return. And after this happens, after we move blood into it, it then increases the central venous pressure because of that movement of blood volume into the thorax. Make sense so far? Mm-hmm.
It's sucking the air from the diaphragm to the lungs because, or up because of the high to low gradient rate.
It's sucking the blood in this
blood,
case.
okay.
Yeah, so this is the blood moving from the abdomen to the lungs. The air is actually going from the outside environment into the thorax because of this same low pressure in the thorax. But
You know, some of those videos for this?
like where stuff is moving.
Yeah.
Not off the top of my head, but I can find us one.
I think that would just.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. Yeah, whenever we're talking about movement, all these arrows get a little squidgy. Okay. So next, we're going to be thinking about factors that overall influence venous pressure and therefore influence venous return, so the return of blood to the heart, because this is going to be important for pressure in the system overall. So for now, what we want to know is if they increase the blood volume, so if there's more blood, this increases the venous pressure. Right? So this is that relationship between size of something and how much stuff is in it again, right? Between the volume of the contents and the volume of the container. So when we have more blood, this increases our venous pressure. If we have less blood, this decreases our venous pressure. We can also think about this a little bit with relationship to those compliance curves that we looked at before, right? So that's fine. Right, so we had pressure, and we had volume, and we saw those curves, right? Basically telling us that as we have more volume, pressure goes up. Right? Before we were comparing arteries to veins, but both of the curves looked like this, they were just at different heights. So we're going to see that we can partially regulate venous pressure along with regulating overall blood pressure, our MAP, right? These are going to be very tied together. Our long-term regulation of the blood pressure is going to be through regulation of this overall blood volume and therefore regulation of venous pressure. And that occurs mainly through what the kidneys are doing, because the kidneys, their basic role is to kind of, to filter out fluid from the blood and have you pee it out as urine, right? So by changing how much blood how much fluid you're urinating, I hope you're not urinating blood. That fluid is coming from your blood initially, right? So by changing how much you lose through urination, you can overall change how much blood volume you have. Because if you keep that fluid inside, it stays in your blood. So we'll talk about that in our renal unit, but that's like why that's tied in here. Okay. So we're going to be thinking about more control and regulation of the venous pressure. So it's helpful now to remember one of our previous concepts, which was our neural and hormonal control, the arterioles and the adrenergic receptors, because we're going to have similar things going on here in our veins. So take a second to kind of flip back to this either in your notes or in your mind. Let's start at the top here. So which of the neurotransmitters are we talking about as being released by the sympathetic nerves themselves? Do you remember the name of it? It's our norepinephrine, yeah. And I have a hell of a time remembering that, so I came up with a hint for myself just earlier. So the N at the beginning means we're coming from the nerve, and this is probably actually how they named it. So the norepinephrine. So that's what's coming out of those sympathetic nerves. Oops. Epinephrine. All right. Okay, so we have our norepinephrine. Our adrenergic receptors, those ones taken epinephrine and norepinephrine. Which of our adrenergic receptors were we interested in as it relates to norepinephrine? Here's the part that requires extra remembering. This is our alpha receptors that we're going to be interested in here. At least, yeah. So our alpha receptors, and on the arterioles, that's doing vasoconstriction. We're remembering this now because our next concept is something called venomotor tone. It's basically the same thing as vasoconstriction, just specifically for veins. So when we say venomotor tone, when we talked about tone of muscles before, we said they were sort of in a constant state of a little bit of contraction. When we talk about increasing venomotor tone, we're saying we're increasing that amount of contraction.
I have a question about the previous one.
Yeah.
Okay, so when we were talking about that, we made that chart,
Mm-hmm.
but then was up in the
Yeah, so there are both affecting the arterioles, but for the norepinephrine, we're just thinking about the alpha. For the epinephrine, we're thinking about the alpha and the beta.
But are you talking like, okay, so when you're talking from the whole ganglion only, that's why norepinephrine?
Oh, okay, yeah. So the norepinephrine and the epinephrine are both ultimately tracing back to the sympathetic nervous system, but the norepinephrine is coming out of those nerves directly, and the epinephrine is coming out of the gland, the adrenal gland. So that's coming out of those chromaffin cells, which are like basically specialized postganglionic nerves, but they're not exactly the same. And that's often why we tend to talk about epinephrine more as a hormone, kind of a neurohormone, because it's coming from that gland and then going into the bloodstream. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so we only really have to worry about our norepinephrine for the venomotor tone here. So that's nice. It's a little less complicated than the arterial situation. The venomotor tone is just the tension of the smooth muscle around the veins. We increase it, we're making those vein walls more tense, we're contracting that smooth muscle. Okay. This means that we're decreasing the veins compliance, which is potentially not totally intuitive. So you think about the fact that compliance is about that relationship between volume and pressure. So by making those vein walls more tense, by contracting them, increasing the tone. Before, we said veins were volume reservoirs, meaning you could put a lot of volume into them and we didn't see a lot of an increase in pressure. That's what high compliance means. But now that we've made those vein walls kind of tense, they can't expand as easily, right? They're not as floppy because they're kind of tensed up. So that is what we mean by decreasing the venous compliance here. So when we decrease the venous compliance, this means we're increasing pressure as well, because we still have volume going into the veins, but now we have those kind of tense walls. So there's more pressure because there's that constraint on the blood. So overall, we want to kind of like number what's going on because sometimes that's helpful. Right, so we'd have the sympathetic nervous system, releasing norepinephrine. As received by the alpha adrenergic receptors in the veins in the smooth muscle. This causes contraction, which causes a decrease in compliance, which causes an increase in pressure. So that's kind of the cascade of things that are happening here. And we're going to go through a flow chart as well. Okay. But after we go through these changes in response ultimately to the sympathetic nervous system, right, our fight or flight part of the autonomic nervous system, our ultimate effect is going to be an increase in venous return, which is one of the factors that we're going to be thinking about as we turn our attention to MAP, to regulation of overall blood pressure as we move forward. Okay. So all of these changes, this increase in sympathetic innervation activity in our veins means we're returning more blood to the heart, which is going to have an effect on the cardiac output, right? This is going to affect how much blood then pumps out of the heart, right? Because that's dependent on all these pressures within the heart itself, which we'll review as we go through our next flow chart. Okay. We're going to start at the top. So we increase our activity in the sympathetic nerves. So we're giving norepinephrine to that smooth muscle in the veins, which means we're increasing our venomotor tone, right? So our initial stimulus here in this diagram is that sympathetic activity. So increase in sympathetic activity increases tone, and an increase in tone makes our veins a little more like the arteries, so it decreases the compliance. There are other things other than the activity of the sympathetic nervous system that affect venous pressure. So one that we are tracking for now is that regulation by the sympathetic nervous system, but we have other factors, right? So factors that have concurrent effects, activity of the muscle pump. So we think sympathetic fight or flight, right? So maybe you're running away from something, you're fighting something, would take muscle movement, right? So this goes together, activity of the muscle pump, activity of the respiratory pump, you're breathing hard, right? All kind of linked together. So this is those two factors. We've already seen how they also increase venous pressure, right? Because they're increasing ultimately that blood flow back towards the heart. Another thing that also affects here that we haven't really talked about, but we understand conceptually that if we have more blood, we have more venous pressure. So that's another thing we might have going on concurrently here, but that would be kind of more a long-term regulation than an instantaneous one. But all four of these factors are going to have the same effect overall on our heart and then on our blood pressure overall. Okay, so from here, changes in any one of these is going to have the same effect. So we've increased our venous pressure, which means as our pressure goes up, right? So we're looking at the heart, right? At our heart, we had our atria on top, our ventricles on the bottom, we had right and left. I'm going to draw in our inferior vena cava going into the right atrium, right? So when we increase our venous return and our venous pressure, what we're saying is now we have higher pressure here. And when the heart is relaxed, right? So in diastole, and the heart is about ready to start filling, beginning, we have low pressure in the atria. As the heart fills, that pressure moves from high to low, so the blood moves from the veins into the heart, which is why an increase in venous return creates an increase in atrial pressure. Does that make sense? This is about that blood going into the right atrium, so we have more pressure because we have more blood there. When we have an increase in atrial pressure, I also call it an increase in end diastolic pressure or preload, because preload or end diastolic pressure is a measure essentially of the pressure in the heart at the end of diastole, so at the end of that relaxation phase. So right before we start contracting the heart, before we start systole in order to pump out the blood. So what we're saying, when we increase venous return, increase atrial pressure, we're increasing the filling of the heart, which we could measure by measuring preload. This is a very linked concept, so an increase in end diastolic pressure goes hand in hand with an increase in end diastolic volume. So that amount of blood in the heart at the end of its filling phase, at the end of its relaxed phase. And if we have more blood in the heart as it's filling, this means we can pump out more blood, right? So if we have an increase in preload or in end diastolic volume, we also have an increase in stroke volume. So that's the amount of the blood coming out of the heart during systole going into the aorta. So that's stuff we talked about way back in December, presumably. So as we have an increase in stroke volume, we increase cardiac output, because hopefully, remember cardiac output, right? We're talking about blood coming out of the heart overall. So that's stroke volume, right? So the amount of blood for one heartbeat times our heart rate, which is our number of heartbeats per minute. So this gives us an overall rate blood flow, which is our cardiac output. Okay. Our over cardiac output is affected by the stroke volume. So this is overall how regulation of the veins affects the cardiac output, right? So if we have an increase in the activity of the sympathetic nervous system, they have an increase in cardiac output, which we knew before, right? But before we were talking about the effects of the sympathetic nerves on the heart itself. So here we're just talking about the fact that, oh, hey, they're also doing things to the veins that increases the cardiac output, right? So this is running parallel to those effects we saw on the heart muscle itself. Okay. Yeah.
Is that kind of the reason why your body can push through so many like injuries or things that are happening while you're in that mode? Because you have multiple systems working together to keep you running for your life. I'm trying to make sure I understand what you're asking. Yeah, it's helpful that we have all these things happening at once, so failure of any one part has an effect. But I think really the reason that you have so much basically power to get oxygen and stuff to your cells and to fuel all that activity is that all of these effects are kind of additive, right? Like not necessarily like you put them into an equation, but the fact that the sympathetic nerves are increasing cardiac output by affecting the veins, and they're also increasing the output by affecting our stroke volume and things in the heart directly, increasing the heart rate directly. It's kind of like, I'm trying to think of an analogy. I don't know if I can, but it's like having 5 different levers, all of which do the same thing, and every time you press them, you get more and more and more. We are going to have a lot of feedback loops here. Yeah, these two have downstream effects. Yeah. In fact, we're not totally done with this chart yet, right? At least click through. This flow chart was just going to the result of the effect on blood pressure. But what we are going to talk about next when we talk about regulation of mean arterial pressure is that, yeah, we have ways to adjust blood pressure when it gets too high or when it gets too low. So probably while sympathetic activity is still going on, this would keep happening and you would have the negative feedback in then. But if we had these things happening for other reasons abnormally, right, we absolutely would have negative feedback when it comes down. Right. So increase in cardiac output, increased our mean arterial pressure. So we could relate this to that flow, pressure, and resistance equation that we've been looking at thus far, but I'm not going to derive those equations again because I think they're a little bit confusing, and I think this is better to think about conceptually. Hopefully these steps make sense for this part. Okay, so we have a couple of questions for you to answer for yourself. But first, we're thinking about skeletal muscle, breathing. Which of these factors are going to be affected and which ones are not going to be affected? Bless you. So here we're thinking about the pumps specifically. I want to make sure that we pay careful attention to what questions are asking. So let's start treating this as a checklist to get our answer. Okay. Our skeletal and respiratory pumps, are they increasing the venous pressure? Yeah. Yep, they are. Right. So we have blood moving back towards the heart. We're pushing blood up into those veins, increasing the pressure. What about the mean arterial pressure? Are we increasing that, our overall blood pressure? We actually are, right? Because of this effect on the venous pressure. Right? And so because of all those factors in the flow chart going together, increasing our diastolic volume, increasing stroke volume, increasing cardiac output, a sort of final effect of the respiratory and skeletal pumps would be an increase in mean arterial pressure. And I suppose I just said this part out loud, right? So part of the way we're increasing that mean arterial pressure is because that venous pressure is causing increased venous return, which is causing increase in diastolic pressure, which is increasing in diastolic volume. What's not happening as a result of the pumps is the increase in venomotor tone. It might be happening at the same time, right? But that venomotor tone is from the sympathetic nervous system, right? So that is a response to sympathetic activity, so to this extrinsic nervous regulation of the veins, rather than specifically to these physical pumps. So all of these things kind of do go together in our flow chart, but only 3 of them would be affected if you changed the skeletal pump or changed the respiratory pump. Okay. This one is more of a remembering thing rather than a logicking thing. Take a second to look at this question. Right. So what we're saying here, right, is it is true that we have 20 liters filtered out of the blood, right? So we'd calculate our NFP, and when we apply that to what happens to the body in the day, we get 20 liters filtered out, calculate it on the other end, on the venous end,
over a day. We have 17 liters absorbed. We can see that those are not the same number, meaning that overall, we have 3 liters that appear to just kind of be hanging out here, right? So if nothing else was happening, we'd have swelling, which we call edema, because we'd have this fluid, the only place it could be going is into the tissue, right? But we know that we don't just start swelling more and more and more every day. So does anybody remember how we're making adjustments here, how we keep that water balance, that blood volume balance here? Yeah, exactly. So our lymphatic system, which is our next topic, is running alongside our capillaries. We're going to see that we have things we call lymphatic capillaries as well, right? Running into lymphatic veins that drain that fluid and ultimately return the fluid to the venous system right before it goes to the heart. So they return that fluid to the heart. So we'll start out with the lymphatics next time. But this is going to be why we don't have swelling happening endlessly day by day. We do get that fluid trapped.